Welcome to this Actus webinar, all about how to create a strong compliance culture. So essentially, this is all looking at how we can pull together the essential elements of fostering a compliance culture within organisations. Very often, compliance and HR are seen as totally separate entities, but the reality is that the only way to generate a culture is by collaborating and working together. And that's what we're going to focus on during this webinar. The agenda for this webinar will cover what the FCA's expectations are around having a compliance culture, really truly understanding the spirit of compliance as opposed to the tick box approach. So we want to make sure that whatever we're doing in our organisations, we are making sure that it embodies integrity, accountability, and ethical behaviour. And that is like a stick of rock through the whole organisation. As I mentioned before, that requires compliance between HR, leadership, and those people in compliance roles. And it's critical to ensure that the communication and the role modelling of behaviours, the messaging that comes from all three of these groups fits together, and there are no cultural red flags. We'll mention how you might spot a cultural red flag and what you might want to do about it, and also some practical steps, as ever with an Actus webinar, how you can practically put this into place and make the whole culture of compliance live and be embodied within your organisation, as opposed to being something that's superficial. Just briefly introducing myself. My name is Lucinda. I'm a chartered psychologist. I've got many years in corporate HR, and I have been involved in embedding compliance processes, performance management processes, you name it. My role currently, I'm coming to you today from someone who is the founder and CEO of Actus. We provide performance management software, compliance software in the form of a product called Actus Comply, and suitable for SMCR, and also Actus Oversight, aimed at the consumer duty, which is why we're presenting this to you. We also offer learning management software. So we have a one-stop shop for performance and compliance, which makes us uniquely positioned to help organisations that are trying to integrate this approach. I also host the award-winning HR Uprising podcast, and we're about to do a mini-series all about cultural compliance. So this is something that you're trying to get right in your organisation. Look out for that mini podcast series. And I'm also an author of 2 books, all about change. And that's why we're talking to you about culture change. It's about behavioural change. It's very much aligned. Just helping you understand a little bit more, as I mentioned earlier, Actus, we offer software which offers a complete performance, compliance and learning management suite. We also have other functionality which sits in the HR space. So do check us out at www.actus.co.uk if you'd like to find out more. Okay, on to our presentation. So I'm sure that those of you listening, if you're in compliance roles, are very familiar with this. If you're more HR, this might be new to you. But essentially, it's bringing these two things together. The FCA, the regulator that's out there, has been talking for the last 2 years about consumer duty expectations and how we should be focusing on improving consumer outcomes. And improving it is not about tick box compliance, it's about embedding a culture of accountability. I mean, this has been going on with the FCA for a number of years. We have clients that follow the SMCR regime, which again is about culture of accountability. But in relation to consumer duty, the FCA expect firms to actually proactively act to deliver really good outcomes for consumers that are improving, making sure that their needs are prioritised in a proactive, not a reactive way. And that includes a number of cultural components. So we need to look at the values of an organisation, the behaviours that are embodied by leaders and everybody throughout the organisation, and levels of accountability right down the organisation, because that essentially is the foundation of a business or a firm that genuinely is walking its talk when it comes to compliance. The FCA mandate that firms embody a culture of compliance, and it needs to be lived, not lip service. And as I've mentioned about accountability, that's emphasised many, many times. How are you going to do that? Well, it's about leadership behaviours. There are expectations, as you'll be aware, in terms of the conduct expectations and fit and proper are different for senior leaders and individuals. And it's about making sure all of these align with a compliant culture. And this for me is where there's a real intersection. It makes no sense for HR and compliance to be entirely detached. Because as soon as you start talking about behaviours, you may talk about something like a competency framework or values framework, and those need to link together. If HR have got a set of competencies that people are being evaluated against during a performance review, it must align with the values that the FCA or the regulator is expecting of the firm. So we need to make sure these things align and are embedded within daily operations and processes. And that's going to make it much easier because everybody is, it's like going with the tide. It's building a strong compliant culture for the organisation that in turn should support and improve consumer interests. So those are our expectations. What are the risks? What do we have to be careful of? Now, many firms say that compliance is basically training. So you might get your free e-learning from whichever professional body you sign up to, and every year people have to go through their compliance training and they roll their eyes and they click, 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 click through in the shortest possible time that they can. Now, the reality of that is that training like that without cultural alignment, it really could undermine true compliance because it devalues it. People going through the motions, maybe it's really dry, it's repetitive, it's not even relevant to your company or industry. And that makes that tick box training, not only does it fail to shift the culture, it makes people fatigued. It's compliance fatigue, it becomes a growing concern. So just saying you've done your e-learning doesn't change culture. And it makes everything seem superficial rather than genuine commitment to compliance. We don't want people to become, fatigued by boring compliance training. And I apologize if you make compliance training. I realize not all training is boring, but something that feels like you're going through the motions, telling you things you already know or that common sense. And it's just being done for the sake of it, as opposed to people genuinely talking about things. And often again, that sort of compliance activity, so firms that we work with, it always astonishes me that certain training goes like clockwork because it's compliance, it's driven by compliance and people do it. And then other training, which is for growth, for individuals thinking about how they can develop themselves, their careers, their behaviours, their self-awareness, that's seen as soft and fluffy training. And actually, how can we bring those two closer together so that the whole thing seems to be much more enriched and real? Other issues with sort of lip service here is, if you see that there are poor examples where people, are allowed to behave in certain ways or go through a tick box, or there's blatant ethical violations where you can see that people are paying lip service. So you might have gone through your training and you're told that you should report something or identify a vulnerable customer in a certain way, yet you can see that someone else sitting next to you in the call center just rolls their eyes, ignores it, and says, "Oh, it'll be fine, no one will ever notice." And those sort of things are noticed by managers or colleagues and are not called out. So you don't want to have this sort of ethical violations in lip service culture. So we want to, training and education is a key part of building a compliance culture, but it's not the only part. What it really does is enforced training just becomes an annual process, just like the performance review, which people complain about. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. So if you do training where there's genuine conversation, let's move away from compliance for a moment and maybe discuss something like equality and diversity training or people being allies or things like that. If you engage people talking about what the consequences are, which is really relevant to consumer duty and vulnerable customers, for example, if you got around a room and rather than going, let's do our annual e-learning that takes us 45 minutes and then it's done, but you sit around the table and say, how would you spot a vulnerable customer? How would you spot a vulnerable customer? What would you do about it? What are the consequences if we don't do anything? Could they be your mum, granny, someone in your family? What's the implications if we don't do this? When have you had an experience of poor consumer outcomes or poor customer service? How can we make sure we don't do this for others? So training, for me, if we really want to shift a culture, you need to get people around tables, or it could be done virtually, talking about it, bringing it to life, engaging with it, and bringing the emotions to life where people go, oh, actually, I would hate that to happen to someone in my family. I'm going to make sure I'm going to behave in a certain way. So we've got to overcome the risks of just tick box and really bring training to life by involving people. And if we look at a very simple principles of compliance culture, that is really about going beyond the rules. So it's integrating the emotions, the values, and the behaviors into everyday practices. It means that people have default integrity. Those people with character integrity, it's just how we do things. In a robust compliance culture, doing the right thing becomes a default action for all employees. And you want to be making sure, okay, it's going to be hard to get everybody, but cultures go one way or the other. So you want to get 80% of people at least. That's the default. And again, this is how if we align our organisational values, and I'll talk more in a moment about how we do that with employee behaviours, that's how you're going to foster accountability and trust, which is self-reinforcing. So cultures, actions speak louder than words. We have to make sure that the leaders, the tone from the top, that they are online with this. So not only what they say, but how they behave. Behaviours speak so much louder than words. So are the leaders online or are they paying lip service? Now, this is where if you're in compliance or HR, and again, I'd say work together, because you may be part of the senior leadership team or you may be part of implementing it. So one down. So how do you challenge them if the tone is not being set? How do you get round the table? And this, again, the same example as I was using in terms of training people about consumer outcomes. How do you get around the table with your leadership team and say, what does us setting a strong tone of integrity look like? What behaviours would we be demonstrating? What behaviours would we not be demonstrating? So get them to truly think about it, to actually think about what they're doing and how they're demonstrating it. So they're very clear that they don't unintentionally undermine your culture. So that's about them understanding the values that you've got as a business. How do you really live them and show they're important as a leader? It's making sure that your behavioural systems, so this is where HR should fit with compliance again, because often HR is the custodian of processes. So think about your performance management process in particular, that can be very useful. So we work with businesses that align their performance management cycle with their fit and proper cycle. Perhaps at different times, that they don't have to go at the same time, because actually if you do them at the same time, that creates a risk of undermining your performance conversations or your talent development conversations. But as part of the same annual process, it does make sense. And we've got a white paper on that you can download if you're interested. And then cultural alignment. So how do we make sure that the behaviours that the leaders are demonstrating and the employees are experiencing demonstrates and fosters trust? Look at your engagement survey. If you haven't got questions in there already, make sure you've got questions that relate to consumer duty or compliance. Does it live and breathe in our organisation? Get some questions in there. That will be fascinating. There's usually a question about leadership. I trust our leadership, or I said look up senior leaders. That's a classic one of the Gallup Q12 questions. And of course, that would be a really good indication as to whether people see that the leaders are walking their talk or not. So you can't set the culture unless your leaders are leading it. So, do some homework, see what people really think about it. So the traits of a strong compliance culture, you're looking for leadership commitment, and that is senior managers are seen to actively sponsor those compliance initiatives and lead by example, not just leave it down to compliance and HR. You want open communication where there's transparent dialogue about compliance issues. People can talk about things with a focus on future improvement as opposed to what went wrong. I mean, you have to work out what went wrong, but make sure we're looking future focus. Training and education, and by that I mean regular meaningful training that's interactive as opposed to one way. And ideally it's human, that emphasizes the why, with your case studies, with examples, bringing it to life. Accountability, of course, that's so important. Make sure that you've got clear roles regarding compliance responsibilities and ownership of mistakes. And think about psychological safety. Again, that's a classic term that often sits in learning and development or HR. What do we really mean by that? We mean that people feel that it's safe within their organisation to take risks, to make mistakes. And for me, this is a classic example where I feel that the whole concept of breach reporting, and also things like the F&P process, where it's almost not allowed for people to have any gaps. For me, that doesn't fit with an environment of continuous improvement. It's almost encouraging people to cover up where they're not quite ready. So it's actually fine for us to realize we've got something to learn in terms of how we might identify a vulnerable customer or an area where we could improve something because we're trying to improve. That doesn't mean we're bad, but we the aspirations shouldn't be meets. It should be how can we get better. So, think creatively about how you can make it fine for obviously people you want to be able to sign off that they are compliance certified. You want to certify them for the year, you have to certify them for the year. But how could you certify with, and this is how we're going to be even better? And I could be even better if next year. And if we're striving as individuals to develop our skills or our behaviors in line with the regime and our values, then that's a really positive way of doing it. And it makes it safe for people to say, oh, I don't think I quite got that right. How could I learn from this? Or is it the best it could be? Giving people that psychological safety to learn and grow. And that in turn is going to benefit consumer outcomes. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we have to join it all up. There's no point having a compliance process and an HR process. We need aligned processes and systems that are seamlessly integrated and are valued equally and seen as purposeful. And by valued equally, I mean that senior managers value it, line managers value it, individual value it, HR and compliance value them. So it's things that are seen like worthwhile conversations. And that all comes down to how well your managers carry them out. It's the way, again, the actions that they have in relation to it. So that's what the traits we're all aspiring to. How do you identify if you might have some red flags in your organization? Well, cultural red flags in organizations, this is the sort of behaviors you need to look out for that might undermine your long-term success. So maybe you might see that there's some inconsistency in behaviours where there's a discrepancy between stated values and actions. How are you going to see that? Well, you might hear it from people saying, oh, it's all very well, they said that. Or you might hear or see a leader behaving in a certain way and then they cancel their performance reviews or they say that can wait. So there's language that you might hear around the leadership table or managers in relation to their people. You could also look at things like 360 feedback as tools to see how the values are seen. Because the very important thing is the individuals, how they see the leadership. So as I was saying, your engagement survey, but you could also do 360 feedback to explore the skills of your leaders and see how those fit in and see if there's any gaps, because this isn't about witch hunting leaders, actually. Leaders may not realize, sometimes they've got our blinkers on, they don't realize that we're unconsciously undermining the organization or these values, this compliance culture, because we've got other pressures like hitting a number, etc. So it's how do we get that balance? And how do we create that self-awareness in a safe, not a blame way? It is so important, though, that leaders are not seen to be hypocritical. It really undermines trust, and that will cascade right down the organisation so quickly. And risks where you're hearing lots about short-term gain. Well, we'll do that in the long run. And I feel like we're in this position politically at the moment. So if you're seeing it's very much short-term thinking, how can you encourage a balance between short-term and long-term? This one is very relevant for HR to think about. So think about your reward processes. Are you very highly driven towards performance, for example, to such an extent that the incentives, prioritize performance over and above everything else, almost to the extent that it could be seen that they promote unethical behaviors or it's unrealistic to support the customer or achieve the customer outcomes when you're almost balancing things and the financial numbers are always going to are always going to lost the word basically trump them that those are going to happen. And then turning a blind eye. So people who don't shout out. Have you got a culture where people are scared to whistle blow? I mean, you don't really want whistleblowing. I see that as quite a public sector negative term, but people feel okay to call it out. Or do you did that, actually it may be better to do it this way, or being helpful. This if you've got a psychologically safe culture, people will help and give feedback and spot things. They won't turn a blind eye. They won't let them go without picking them up. So that makes a big difference. So you want to make sure you haven't got those in your organization. You can look at some of these things. A lot of these you'll notice, pick up on. Maybe you have to go out and consciously view them. You can do a cultural audit. We've got to download a cultural audit tool that you can download. We'll put links at the end if you want to get one of those. And that could be something just to prompt your thinking about what your culture looks like. So on to our practical next steps. So if we want to align our HR and our compliance processes, particularly with the emphasis on consumer duty, my starting point would be make sure that you link your goals, as in people's objectives and organisational goals. They link and are aligned to the consumer duty outcomes that you've prioritised within your organisation for success. Because that way, if people, and that's cascaded through the organisation, make sure there is an alignment as opposed to a disconnect between those organisational goals and the outcomes that you're after, because that's going to foster accountability. It means your reward processes are aligned with those outcomes, and it makes everyone's clear what they need to work on and why. We have to hold leaders and managers accountable. They must understand that their unspoken behaviours speak really loudly. In fact, they shout about the value of compliance or the performance process. Find a way of really, if you want to embed values, bringing them up and making them more visible. So maybe you can put recognition systems in place for people living the values. Maybe you can make sure that at team meetings, people identify someone who lived the values. They recognise others. There's peer recognition. There's articles in your newsletter or on your intranet. And of course, they're woven into things like performance review processes. Really make a point of recognising them as opposed to them feeling like values that sit on a wall and are ignored. Because the more they're recognised, the more people, it's almost like rewarding children, the more people will want to align their own behaviours with them, and they ultimately become how we do things around here or the way of a culture. Do try to address any misalignment as early as possible. So look out for those red flags and address them positively. Then you can nip issues in the bud, and it creates this culture of transparency that people can, make mistakes and just be corrected. Performance reviews, make sure you've got really open communication during performance reviews, that they're meaningful, making sure that people feel that they get honest feedback, learning from mistakes. And that's going to balance both the compliance and performance, that people can see on top of that, that they're being rewarded for how they behave, not just the goals and what they achieve. Of course, having aligned goals makes it quite lined up, and that's helpful too. And then finally, again, it's interesting. A lot of this is about how people are managed. Your performance management process include things like regular check-ins or one-to-ones where people monitor progress against objectives, but that also allows for timely adjustments of goals to objectives and picking people up on little behaviours that maybe they could improve, reinforcing accountability and awareness of whether they are living the values and aligning with the consumer duty, or whether they need to learn or they could improve it in any way. So that's my short webinar, giving you a few highlights. If you'd like the download of the slides, we can send them out to you. We've also got lots of other useful links and resources that I'll just mention to you now. We've got a consumer duty metrics directory. If that's something you're thinking, what metrics have other firms done? We've got them for a range of firms, different types of organisation, for inspiration. So you can have a look at some consumer duty metrics, because one of the key things there, and I will do another webinar on this, is outcomes. Make sure they are genuine outcomes, because we should be improving consumer outcomes. There's a white paper I wrote about SMCR, but it actually is relevant to consumer duty as well. But it's how can you weave your SMCR compliance culture, or any kind of compliance culture, into the performance management process, which we've been talking about just now. And I've also got an HR Uprising podcast on compliance culture, and there is likely to be a whole series or even a podcast, if it's very popular, on compliance culture. So do look up the HR Uprising podcast if you're into those. There's a whole lot of content on that, both HR and compliance and organisational development and change. So I'm sure you'll find something of use there, and keep an eye out for our compliance culture series coming soon. And finally, Actus Oversight just launched this year, 2025. It is a really simple, cost-effective way for you to streamline consumer duty compliance and assign accountability through your organisation. Not that into your performance management process, that means you could have one-stop shop for performance management and compliance. So if you'd like to know more, just visit the website or get in touch on info@actus.co.uk. Thank you for joining me.